Dust rose in the dry air as the scorching sun beat down on the weathered wooden corral. Inside, a wild Mustang panted heavily, his eyes flickering with both fear and defiance. His chestnut coat was slick with sweat and dirt, his muscles trembling from exhaustion. His name was Spirit, a horse born free, once running wild across the open plains of the West, until human hands tore him away from that life. Now, trapped and cornered, his soul fought desperately against the forces trying to break him. Outside the corral, a group of men stood watching in silence. Among them was Jim Rawlings, a ruthless trainer known for his brutal methods. He gripped a whip tightly, studying Spirit with cold, calculating eyes. For weeks, he had tried to tame the Mustang, but the horse refused to yield. To Rawlings, a wild horse was just an animal that hadn't yet learned to obey. The sharp crack of the whip sliced through the air like a lightning strike, and Spirit instinctively flinched, his nostrils flaring with a mix of fear and fury. Rawlings stepped forward with steady, unrelenting steps, forcing the animal closer to the fence. "You'll learn, one way or another," he muttered through clenched teeth, preparing for yet another round of training. Spirit knew what was coming. He had felt the harsh pull of the reins, the violent yanks on his mane, the blows that came when he refused the saddle. But deep inside, a fire still burned, a flame that refused to be extinguished. He did not belong here. He never would. The men around the corral continued to watch, some with curiosity, others with a hint of unease. They all knew that Rawlings did not tolerate failure, and if Spirit didn't break soon, his fate could be far worse than another brutal training session. Then, just as Rawlings raised the whip again, something changed in the Mustang's eyes. In an instant, fear gave way to something far more dangerous, a fierce decision. He would not submit anymore. Spirit's chest rose and fell rapidly, his nostrils flaring as he took in the scent of sweat, dust, and tension. His muscles were coiled like steel springs, his body ready to fight, though exhaustion clawed at the edges of his strength. Across from him, Jim Rawlings stood firm, his whip gripped tightly in his calloused hand. The trainer's frustration was evident, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with barely contained rage. He had spent weeks trying to break this Mustang, but Spirit refused to surrender. The crowd of ranch hands surrounding the corral murmured amongst themselves, exchanging uneasy glances. They had seen Rawlings break dozens of wild horses, but something about Spirit was different. He wasn't just resisting, he was fighting back. Even in his battered state, there was something unbreakable in the way he held his head high, something untamed in his burning gaze. It was a defiance they had never seen last this long. Rawlings exhaled sharply, raising the whip again. The leather cracked through the air like a gunshot, snapping just inches from Spirit's flank. The Mustang reared onto his hind legs, his hooves slashing at the empty space above him, his scream piercing the thick, dry air. His powerful form cast a shadow against the dirt, his mane wild and unkempt, a living symbol of something that should never have been caged. The men watching took an unconscious step back. They weren't sure who was in control anymore, Rawlings or the horse. Rawlings was losing patience. His usual methods weren't working, and he could feel the eyes of his men on him, waiting to see if he could truly tame this beast. His pride was on the line now. If he let Spirit win, it wouldn't just be a failure, it would be humiliation. That was something Jim Rawlings did not tolerate. With a sharp motion, he turned to one of his ranch hands. "Get the rope," he ordered, his voice like gravel. A young man scrambled to obey, quickly coiling a thick lasso in his hands. The plan was simple: lasso the Mustang, yank him off balance, and force him to the ground. Rawlings had done it 100 times before. He'd force Spirit into submission, make him understand that freedom was no longer an option. But Spirit wasn't ready to be owned. As soon as the lasso flew through the air, Spirit exploded into motion. His hooves barely touched the ground as he dodged to the side, faster than anyone had anticipated. The rope missed his neck by mere inches, landing limply in the dirt. The ranch hand who had thrown it stumbled forward, thrown off balance by the force of his own failed attempt. Before he could recover, Spirit's instincts took over. With a powerful kick, he sent a spray of dust into the air, blinding everyone for a split second. And then he charged. Rawlings barely had time to register what was happening before 1,000 pounds of raw muscle and fury were coming straight at him. The last thing he saw before the impact was Spirit's wild, untamed eyes, the eyes of something that refused to be broken. Time seemed to slow as Spirit charged forward, his powerful hooves pounding against the dry earth, sending up clouds of dust with every step. The men around the corral gasped, their instincts screaming at them to move, to do something, but they were frozen in place, caught between awe and fear. Never before had they seen a horse turn against a man with such raw, unshakable defiance. Rawlings' expression shifted from shock to fury in an instant. He had always prided himself on being in control, over his men, over the animals, over everything within his reach. But Spirit was proving him wrong. The Mustang wasn't just running, he was fighting. And that was something Rawlings could not allow. With lightning-fast reflexes, the trainer yanked the coiled rope from his belt, his fingers tightening around the rough fibers. He had only one chance. If he missed, the full force of the Mustang's charge would slam into him like a battering ram. With a grunt, he swung the rope in a wide arc, aiming to snag Spirit's neck and end this rebellion once and for all. But Spirit had learned from his suffering. He had felt the sting of that rope before, had been dragged and beaten, had nearly lost himself to the crushing weight of submission. Not this time. At the last possible second, Spirit veered sharply to the right, his hooves digging into the earth as he twisted his body with impossible speed. The rope sliced through the air, missing him by inches. Rawlings barely had time to curse before the full force of Spirit's muscular hind legs launched a devastating kick straight into his chest. The impact was bone-shattering. A sickening crack echoed through the corral as Rawlings was lifted off his feet and thrown backward. He hit the ground hard, the air leaving his lungs in a single painful wheeze. For the first time in his life, Jim Rawlings wasn't the one in control. Silence fell over the ranch. No one moved. The men who had once stood ready to assist Rawlings now exchanged uncertain glances. Spirit stood tall, his chest heaving, his nostrils flaring as he turned to face the stunned onlookers. His message was clear. He would never be broken. Rawlings groaned, struggling to lift himself from the dirt, but his body refused to cooperate. His ribs screamed in protest, and as he coughed, a metallic taste filled his mouth. Spirit had done what no man had ever dared. He had put Jim Rawlings in the dirt. And the Mustang wasn't done yet. With a powerful shake of his head, Spirit turned his gaze toward the corral's wooden fence, his last obstacle to freedom. His heart pounded as he prepared for one final act of defiance, one that would either set him free forever or cost him everything. The world seemed to hold its breath as Spirit faced the fence, his wild eyes locked onto the last barrier between him and the open plains. The scent of sweat and dirt filled the air, thick with tension. Behind him, Jim Rawlings lay sprawled in the dust, coughing and gasping for breath, his ribs aching from the brutal impact of Spirit's hooves. The once feared trainer had been brought to his knees, not by another man, but by a horse that refused to be broken. The ranch hands stood motionless, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and something else, doubt. Doubt in Rawlings, in his brutal methods, in everything they had been taught about taming a wild horse. Spirit had fought back, and now he had a choice. Would he stay and risk another battle, or run? But Spirit already knew the answer. His powerful legs dug into the dry earth, muscles coiling like a spring about to release. Every instinct in his body screamed for freedom, for the open land that stretched beyond this cruel prison. This was his moment. With an explosion of power, Spirit surged forward, his hooves barely touching the ground as he galloped straight toward the wooden fence. The men watching barely had time to react before the Mustang launched himself into the air, his body stretching over the barrier that had confined him for so long. For a second, it felt as if time had frozen. The sunlight caught the dust swirling beneath him, the wind tangled in his wild mane, his muscles rippling as he soared. Spirit wasn't just a horse anymore. He was a force of nature, untamed, unstoppable. Then, impact. His hooves struck the ground on the other side of the fence, sending a shockwave through the earth. He had done it. The men in the corral turned in stunned silence, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Spirit had escaped. Rawlings, still struggling to sit up, could do nothing but watch as the Mustang tore across the open land, his stride stretching farther with each powerful gallop. Dust billowed behind him, a fading reminder of the battle that had just been won. The trainer's fingers dug into the dirt as he seethed with fury. His greatest failure was now running free. The other ranch hands exchanged hesitant glances. Some felt relief, others admiration, but none dared to chase after him. Deep down, they knew they never could. Spirit wasn't just escaping a corral. He was leaving behind everything that had tried to break him. And as he vanished into the horizon, the legend of the Mustang that no man could tame had just begun. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the vast, open land. Spirit ran like he had never run before, his hooves pounding against the dry earth, his breath coming in steady bursts. The wind roared past his ears, tangling his mane, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was free. The corral, the pain, the cruelty of Jim Rawlings, it was all behind him now, swallowed by the dust of his escape. But the fight wasn't over yet. Back at the ranch, Rawlings staggered to his feet, clutching his aching ribs, his face twisted in pure rage. He wasn't about to let that damn horse make a fool out of him. His pride, his reputation, everything was at stake. If word got out that he had been bested by a Mustang, he would never live it down. "Get the horses!" he barked, his voice hoarse but filled with fury. The ranch hands hesitated for a split second, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Spirit's escape had shaken them. They had seen something in that horse, a spirit too wild to be caged, a defiance too strong to break. But Rawlings' glare burned through them like a hot iron. No one dared disobey. Within minutes, the chase was on. 5 riders, led by Rawlings, galloped out of the ranch at full speed, their silhouettes dark against the golden horizon. The dust from their horses' hooves rose in thick clouds, swirling through the dry air. They followed Spirit's tracks, the deep imprints in the dirt revealing the path of his desperate flight. Spirit could hear them coming. The thunder of hooves, the shouts of men, the sharp whistle of a lasso being readied. His muscles burned, but he pushed himself harder, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had come too far to be captured now. The open plains stretched endlessly ahead, but Spirit knew the land well. He had roamed these fields before, long before he was taken. He wasn't just running. He was leading them into his world. Rawlings leaned forward in his saddle, his teeth clenched as he pulled his horse harder. He was gaining ground. Spirit was fast, but no horse could outrun riders forever. A cruel smile curled at the edge of the trainer's lips. He was going to make that Mustang pay. The gap between hunter and hunted was closing, and Spirit knew he had one last chance. Up ahead, the land dipped into a narrow canyon, its walls steep and jagged. It was a risk, but Spirit had no choice. Either he made it through, or he would be trapped. Taking a deep breath, he charged toward the canyon's entrance, the pounding of hooves behind him growing louder. Rawlings was right on his tail. The chase had reached its most dangerous moment, and only one of them would win. Chapter 6. The Canyon Trap. The wind howled through the narrowing canyon as Spirit surged forward, his hooves kicking up loose stones with every stride. His breath came in deep, powerful bursts, his chest burning from the relentless sprint. The riders were close, too close. The echo of their hooves bounced off the canyon walls, making it impossible to tell exactly how far behind they were. But Spirit didn't need to look back. He could feel them. Rawlings gritted his teeth as he urged his horse faster. He had the Mustang cornered now. The canyon walls grew tighter, their sheer rock faces rising on either side like prison bars. There was nowhere left to run. He could already picture it. Spirit, exhausted, slowing down, finally realizing that his escape had been futile. And then, with one last crack of the whip, Rawlings would reclaim what was his. But Spirit was not his. He had never been. As the Mustang reached the deepest part of the canyon, he made his move. His sharp eyes scanned the terrain ahead, seeking something, anything, and then he saw it. A narrow, rocky ledge, barely wide enough to hold a horse's weight, carved into the canyon wall just above a steep drop. It was dangerous. Reckless. One misstep could send him plummeting. But Spirit didn't hesitate. With a final burst of strength, he leaped onto the ledge, his hooves barely finding their grip on the loose stone. A shower of rocks tumbled down the cliffside, crashing into the depths below. The riders skidded to a stop. "No!" Rawlings roared, yanking his horse's reins. His mount reared, spooked by the sudden movement, nearly throwing him off. The other ranch hands barely managed to halt in time before reaching the ledge. Their horses snorted and pawed at the ground, unwilling to follow where Spirit had gone. They could only watch, stunned, as the Mustang scaled the impossible path. His muscles rippled with effort, his breath heavy but determined. Step by step, he climbed higher. The sun shone on his sweat-soaked coat, his mane wild in the wind. Rawlings' fury boiled over. He ripped the lasso from his belt and swung it high, aiming for Spirit's neck. But the Mustang was faster. At the last second, Spirit lunged forward with one final leap, his most daring yet. For an instant, he hung in the air, the sun catching his powerful form, and then he landed. On the other side, the riders could only stare. Spirit had done the impossible. He stood tall on the opposite ledge, just out of reach. For a moment, he turned to look at them, his dark eyes burning with something undeniable, victory. And then, without another glance, he ran. Rawlings stood frozen, fists clenched, his entire body trembling with rage. He had lost. Spirit was gone. The canyon walls swallowed the Mustang's form as he vanished into the wild, where no man could ever touch him again. The chase was over, and Spirit had won. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson as Spirit disappeared beyond the canyon's edge. His hooves barely touched the earth as he ran, his powerful strides fueled by something more than instinct, freedom. The land stretched endlessly before him, open and wild, untouched by the cruelty of men. He was home. Behind him, at the canyon's edge, Jim Rawlings stood motionless, fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, his ribs still aching from the devastating blow Spirit had delivered. Around him, the other ranch hands exchanged uneasy glances, waiting for their leader to speak. But Rawlings said nothing. His silence was heavier than any curse he could have muttered. One by one, the men began to turn their horses around, knowing the truth that Rawlings refused to accept. The chase was over. No lasso, no whip, no amount of force could bring Spirit back now. Some things were never meant to be owned. As the riders retreated, their figures shrinking against the fading light, Rawlings remained. His jaw clenched, his pride shattered. He had lost. But more than that, he had been defied. By a horse. A Mustang that had refused to be broken. Far ahead, Spirit galloped through the night, his silhouette blending into the rolling hills. His heart still pounded from the chase, but now, with each breath, the weight of captivity faded. He was no longer a prisoner. No longer a name on a ranch ledger. He was a legend. 4 miles and miles, the land stretched empty before him, yet he was not alone. The wind howled at his side, carrying whispers of his story across the plains. His hooves struck the ground with a rhythm as old as time itself, a song of defiance, of survival, of victory. And somewhere in the distance, under the endless sky, a herd of wild mustangs raised their heads, ears pricked toward the sound of a familiar spirit returning home. The night air was crisp and filled with the scent of sagebrush and damp earth as Spirit ran beneath the vast, open sky. The stars stretched endlessly above him, shimmering like distant flames, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he was not running from something. He was running toward something. His powerful strides carried him deeper into the wilderness, his hooves leaving imprints in the soft earth. The wind roared through his mane, whispering tales of the past, but Spirit didn't look back. There was nothing left for him in that world of fences and cruelty. Then, in the distance, he heard it. A faint, rhythmic pounding against the ground. Hoofbeats. Spirit slowed his pace, his ears flicking forward, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent on the breeze. It was familiar. Wild. Like him. He followed the sound, weaving through the moonlit hills, his heart hammering in anticipation. Could it be? As he crested a ridge, the sight before him stole his breath away. A herd of mustangs. They moved like shadows beneath the moonlight, their sleek bodies gliding through the valley in perfect harmony. Their coats shimmered in shades of chestnut, black, and gray, their manes flowing like ribbons in the wind. They were free. Untouched. Wild. Spirit stood motionless, his muscles tense, his heart pounding with an emotion he hadn't felt in so long, belonging. Then, as if sensing his presence, the lead stallion lifted his head. His deep, dark eyes locked onto Spirit's, studying him with silent authority. He was older, his body scarred from past battles, but his stance was proud, unwavering. For a moment, neither moved. It was a test. A challenge. Spirit did not back down. With a powerful shake of his head, he stepped forward, his body strong and unyielding. The herd watched in silence as he approached, their ears flicking, their nostrils flaring. He was one of them. But he had to prove it. Then, the lead stallion charged. Spirit didn't hesitate. He met the challenge head-on, his muscles burning as he lunged forward. Their hooves struck the earth in unison, their bodies colliding in a clash of strength and will. Dust swirled around them as they reared, their sharp cries echoing through the valley. For long moments, the battle raged, not for survival, but for acceptance. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The stallion exhaled, stepping back, his gaze lingering on Spirit. A silent understanding passed between them. Spirit had proven himself. With a flick of his tail, the stallion turned and galloped forward. And this time, Spirit followed. The herd moved as one, their hoofbeats thundering against the open plains. The wind carried their freedom across the land, a whisper, a song, a promise. Spirit was home. The first light of dawn stretched across the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of amber and violet. Spirit ran at the heart of the herd, his hooves striking the earth in perfect rhythm with the mustangs around him. The wind roared past his ears, carrying the scent of fresh grass and wildflowers, a scent he had almost forgotten during his time in captivity. He was no longer alone, no longer a prisoner. He was one of them. The herd moved like a living river, flowing across the endless plains with effortless grace. Young foals kicked up their heels in playful bursts of energy, while mares nickered softly, keeping their pace steady. The lead stallion ran just ahead, his dark coat gleaming in the rising sun, his presence a quiet but undeniable force. Spirit had fought for this moment. He had faced the worst of humanity, endured pain, loss, and cruelty. And he had won. But as he ran, a strange feeling tugged at the edges of his mind, a shadow of the past he couldn't quite shake. He thought of Jim Rawlings, of the ranch hands, of the whip, the ropes, the fenced corral that had once threatened to steal his very soul. Had they moved on? Or were they still out there, searching for him? Waiting for the moment he let his guard down? Spirit tossed his head, pushing the thought away. That world was behind him now. But as the herd crested a ridge, a sudden sharp scent hit his nostrils, something unnatural. His ears pricked forward, his muscles tensing as his instincts screamed a warning. Smoke. The lead stallion halted abruptly, his head snapping up as he sniffed the air. The herd followed suit, their bodies going still, ears twitching, eyes scanning the horizon. Something was wrong. And then Spirit saw it. Far in the distance, a thin column of dark smoke twisted into the sky. It wasn't the smoke of a natural wildfire, it was controlled, deliberate. And it was coming from the direction of the ranch. A chill ran through Spirit's body. Rawlings. Had the trainer truly given up? Or was this a sign that the battle wasn't over yet? The herd shifted uneasily, waiting for the lead stallion's command. The older horse snorted, shaking his mane, before turning sharply to lead them away from the danger. Their survival depended on distance, on avoiding the threats of men. But Spirit didn't move. Something inside him held him there, staring at the smoke rising into the sky like a warning. The world had given him a second chance at freedom. But now, as the herd disappeared into the rolling hills, he couldn't ignore the feeling that his past wasn't finished with him yet. And the choice he made next could change everything. Spirit stood frozen, his chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths as he watched the thin column of smoke twisting into the sky. It was a reminder of the world he had escaped, a world of fences, ropes, and cruel hands. The herd was already disappearing into the hills, their hoofbeats fading into the distance, choosing survival over uncertainty. But Spirit couldn't move. Something in that rising smoke felt wrong, like unfinished business. He had won his freedom, but had he truly escaped? Or was this fight not over yet? With one last glance toward the retreating herd, Spirit made his choice. He turned back. His hooves struck the earth with renewed purpose as he galloped toward the ranch, the wind rushing past his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to stay away, to leave the past buried in the dust where it belonged. But Spirit wasn't running on instinct anymore. He was running on something greater. As he neared the ranch, the familiar scent of sweat, leather, and smoldering wood filled his nostrils. The corral stood as it always had, a prison for those who refused to be tamed. But this time, Spirit was not the one trapped inside. He skidded to a stop on a ridge overlooking the property, his keen eyes scanning the scene below. And that's when he saw him. Jim Rawlings. The trainer stood near a burning pile of wooden fencing, his face shadowed by the flickering flames. His ribs were still wrapped in bandages from their last encounter, and in his hand a coiled rope hung loosely at his side. But something was different. His stance wasn't the same confident, cruel posture Spirit had come to know. His shoulders were heavier, his movements slower. Rawlings turned, as if sensing the Mustang's presence. For a long moment, man and horse locked eyes once again. Spirit expected to see rage, defiance, a renewed attempt to take back control. But instead, he saw something unexpected. Defeat. Rawlings exhaled, the tension in his body melting away as he let the rope fall to the ground. His eyes, once burning with determination, now carried something else entirely: acceptance. Spirit stepped forward, watching as Rawlings took a slow step back, raising a hand, not to strike, not to grab, but in surrender. "Go on then," the trainer muttered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "You win." For the first time, Spirit understood. Rawlings had lost more than a horse that day. He had lost control over something he was never meant to own. Spirit snorted, his breath misting in the cool air. Then, without another glance, he turned and ran. He didn't look back. Not this time. As the ranch faded behind him, Spirit knew he was finally, truly free. No fences, no whips, no cages. Just the endless land stretching before him, waiting to be conquered. And far in the distance, the herd was waiting. His herd. The wind howled through the valleys, carrying with it the story of the Mustang that no man could tame. The legend of Spirit would live on, whispered through the canyons, told beneath the stars, remembered in the echoes of hooves pounding against the earth. Forever wild. Forever free.